The candle on Duke Marcus's writing desk had burned low, and he had not noticed. His housekeeper would scold him for it come morning, the way she always did, muttering about wasted wax while he sat unmoved by the fire, staring at ledgers he had no real interest in reading. Christmas had brought him no comfort in 6 years. It had only ever brought him the sound of his own thoughts, louder now that half his hearing was gone. He heard the knock at the study door before he understood who it might be. Everyone else in the house had long since retired, and Marcus preferred it that way. He called out gruffly for whoever it was to enter, expecting a servant with some trivial matter that could easily have waited until sunrise. It was Vivian. She stood in the doorway with snow still clinging to the hem of her cloak, her dark hair coming loose from its pins after a day spent working in the cold library wing. In her arms, she carried something wrapped in cloth, held the way carefully and deliberately. "Your Grace," she said, "I did not wish to disturb your evening, but I could not wait until tomorrow to give you this." Marcus set down his pen. In the 3 months since he had hired her to restore the neglected shelves of his late father's library, Vivian had proven herself quietly stubborn, unwilling to be dismissed the way most of his staff were dismissed, with a wave of his hand and a curt word. She had never once brought him anything beyond a list of books requiring repair. This was different, and something in her expression told him she knew it too. "It is Christmas night," she said, stepping further into the room. "I thought perhaps you might allow yourself one gift." He almost refused her. He nearly told her to leave the parcel on the desk and see herself out, the way he had refused every well-meaning gesture offered to him since the accident that had taken the hearing from his left ear, and, with it, the will to sit at his own pianoforte. But there was something in the careful way she held the bundle, as though it might break if handled roughly, that made him hold out his hands instead. The cloth fell away to reveal a leather portfolio, its corners worn soft with age, bound shut with a faded ribbon that had once been a deep burgundy and was now closer to the color of dried rose petals. Marcus turned it over in his hands, frowning. "Where did you find this?" "Open it first," Vivian said. "Please." He untied the ribbon with fingers that had grown clumsy over the years, more accustomed to holding ledgers than delicate things. The portfolio opened to reveal sheets of parchment, yellowed and brittle at the edges, covered in dense, handwritten notation. For a moment, Marcus simply stared at the ink, at the particular slant of the notes climbing and falling across the staff lines, at the small flourish the composer always added at the end of a phrase, like a signature disguised as decoration. His hands began to tremble. He knew that hand. He had spent 4 years of his youth studying beneath it, copying exercises late into the night under its correction, memorizing its impatient scrawl in the margins of his early compositions. It belonged to Master Julian, the finest composer Marcus had ever known, the man who had died suddenly 9 years before, leaving behind an unfinished symphony that Marcus had never been able to bring himself to speak of, let alone complete. "This cannot be," Marcus whispered. His voice had lost its usual measured coldness. "This is the second movement. The one he never finished. The one that was lost when his rooms were cleared after his death." "It was not lost, Your Grace," Vivienne said gently. "It was hidden." Marcus looked up at her, and for the first time since she had entered the room, he truly looked at her, not as a servant hired to dust his shelves, but as a woman who had just placed something impossible into his hands. His grief, old and familiar, rose in his chest alongside something else he had not felt in years. Hope, perhaps, though it frightened him more than the grief ever had. "Where," he said slowly, "did you find my mentor's handwriting, when every soul in England believes these pages burned or lost?" Vivienne hesitated, and in that hesitation, Marcus felt the first thread of suspicion creep back into his mind, the old instinct that had protected him since the accident, when half the world had seemed intent on either pitying him or taking advantage of his diminished state. "I found fragments," she said carefully, "in a place I do not think anyone thought to look. I have spent some months piecing them back together, restoring the ink where it had faded, matching the torn edges. I did not want to bring it to you until I was certain it was whole enough to be understood." Months, Marcus repeated. You have known of this for months and said nothing. I was not certain what I had found until recently. I did not wish to raise your hopes over scraps of paper that might have amounted to nothing. Marcus set the portfolio down on his desk with the same reverence he might have shown a sleeping infant, then looked at the fire, unable for a moment to meet her eyes. 9 years of silence, 9 years of refusing to touch his own instrument, and now this. A gift he had not asked for and did not know if he could bear to accept. You should not have kept this from me, he said quietly. Whatever your reasons. Perhaps not, Vivian answered, but I could not risk giving you half a truth and watching you lose hope in it a second time. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Blackwood Manor, silent and indifferent to the quiet upheaval taking place within its walls. Marcus did not yet know what Vivian had truly disturbed by bringing those pages into his study, nor how far the consequences of her discovery would reach beyond the manor's frost-covered grounds. He knew only that his hands, resting now on parchment his mentor had once touched, had not stopped trembling. Morning came grey and quiet over Blackwood Manor, the snow from the night before settling thick along the windowsills of the east wing. Marcus had not slept. He had sat by the dying fire until the candle guttered out entirely, the portfolio open before him, reading and rereading the same 8 bars of notation until he could have written them out blind. He found Vivian in the library shortly after breakfast, standing on a low stool as she returned a stack of restored volumes to their shelf, her sleeves pushed back and a smear of dust along one cheek. She startled slightly when he entered, though she recovered her composure quickly, setting down the last book before turning to face him. Your Grace, I did not expect you this early. I did not sleep, Marcus said. He did not bother with pleasantries. I have questions, and I would have answers before I allow myself to believe any further in what you gave me last night. Of course. She stepped down from the stool. You told me you found fragments. You did not tell me where. He folded his arms, studying her the way he might study a contract he suspected of containing a hidden clause. I have made inquiries before, Miss Blythe, in the years since my mentor's death. Every dealer, every collector, every rival composer who might have laid hands on his final papers. I was told repeatedly that nothing remained, that his rooms were cleared of every scrap before I even received word of his passing. So you will forgive me if I wonder how a woman hired 3 months ago to catalogue my late father's books came to possess pages that eluded me for 9 years. Vivian did not flinch from the accusation sitting plainly beneath his words, though a flush rose in her cheeks. You suspect I purchased them, perhaps from someone who ought not to have had them in the first place. I suspect nothing yet. I am asking. She drew a slow breath, folding her hands in front of her apron. Then I will tell you plainly, and you may judge for yourself. When I first came to catalogue this library, I was told the old music room beyond the cellar stairs held nothing of value, that its contents were merely broken furniture awaiting disposal. I went down regardless, out of curiosity more than duty, because I had heard your mentor once taught within these walls, and I wondered whether any of his old teaching materials might have survived among the clutter. Marcus's jaw tightened at the mention of the cellar. He had not set foot down there in years. It had been his father's decision, made shortly after Master Julian's death, to clear the music room and store its ruined contents out of sight. A decision Marcus had never questioned, because he had never wanted to think of that room at all. Go on, he said. Among the furniture there was a parlor piano, badly damaged, its casing split, and its strings long since rusted through. I assumed it was ordinary rubbish, until I noticed the frame beneath the soundboard had been altered. Someone had removed a section of the internal bracing and replaced it with something else entirely. Pages folded small and pressed flat, tucked into the gap and sealed with a strip of cloth glued along the edge, as though whoever placed them there wished them hidden rather than simply stored. You are certain of this, that it was deliberate? Entirely certain, Your Grace. No accident places paper so carefully inside a wooden frame and glues cloth over the opening to disguise it. Someone hid those pages inside that piano on purpose and left it to be locked away with the rest of the ruined furniture, likely trusting that no one would ever think to look inside broken casing bound for the woodpile. Marcus turned away from her, walking slowly to the tall window that overlooked the frozen gardens below. His mentor had taught him for 4 years in that very music room before his death, had sat him at that same piano more times than he could count, correcting his posture, his fingering, his impatience. It was not difficult to imagine Master Julian, in his final weeks, growing fearful that his unfinished work might be seized or destroyed, choosing instead to hide it somewhere he trusted, inside an instrument he knew well, in a house belonging to a pupil he trusted more than most. "And you kept this discovery to yourself for 3 months, Marcus said, his back still to her. "Why?" "Because the pages I first found were in a dreadful state, Your Grace. Torn, stained by damp, several fragments no larger than my palm. I did not know at first whether they were even part of the same work, or merely scraps of some abandoned exercise. I spent weeks simply sorting them by ink and hand before I dared hope they belonged together at all. Only once I began piecing the fragments into sequence did I recognize the shape of a symphony movement, and by then I judged it wiser to finish the restoration properly before bringing you something that might crumble the moment you touched it." Marcus turned back to her at last. His expression had lost some of its hardness, though suspicion still lingered at its edges. "You might have told me the moment you suspected it was his work. Instead, you chose to labor over it alone, in secret, for months, without my knowledge or consent." "I chose to protect it," Vivian said, meeting his gaze without apology. "Forgive me if that was the wrong decision, but I have seen how carelessly precious things are handled when too many hands are permitted near them too soon. I wish to give you something whole, not a puzzle you would have to solve piece by piece while I stood by hoping I had guessed correctly." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire in the library grate crackled softly, and somewhere beyond the door a servant's footsteps passed and faded down the corridor. "I should like to see this piano," Marcus said finally. "The one you found it in." Vivian inclined her head. "Whenever you wish, Your Grace. Though I warn you, the cellar has not been disturbed in some years. It may prove an unpleasant errand." "Unpleasant," Marcus repeated, glancing once more at the portfolio he had carried with him from the study, still clutched beneath his arm. "I do not think unpleasant will trouble me half so much as not knowing." 2 days passed before Marcus found the resolve to descend into the cellar, and even then he told himself it was curiosity rather than dread that kept delaying him. He busied himself with correspondence, with the tedious business of the estate, with anything that might postpone the moment he would have to stand once more in the room where his mentor had spent his final months. It was Vivian, in the end, who reminded him without a word being exchanged. She left a lantern outside his study door on the second evening, its wick trimmed and ready, a small and deliberate gesture that told him plainly enough that further delay would not be permitted to pass unnoticed. He found her waiting at the top of the cellar stairs the following afternoon, a shawl wrapped over her working dress against the chill that always lingered below ground, even in the mildest months. She said nothing about his absence over the past 2 days, for which he was grateful. "The stairs are uneven near the bottom," she warned, lifting her own lantern. "Mind your footing, Your Grace." The descent was slow. Marcus had not realized how far the cellar stretched beneath the manor until he found himself walking corridor after corridor of stacked crates and shrouded furniture, the air growing colder and staler with each turn. When they finally reached the old music room, tucked at the very end of the passage behind a door that had swollen with damp and required Vivian's shoulder to force open, Marcus stopped in the threshold and could not immediately make himself step inside. The room was smaller than he remembered, though perhaps it had only felt larger once, filled with the sound of his mentor's voice and the constant correction of his playing. Now it held only dust sheets and broken chairs, a shattered music stand leaning drunkenly against one wall, and, beneath a torn covering near the far corner, the unmistakable silhouette of a piano. "There," Vivian said quietly, gesturing with her lantern. Marcus crossed the room slowly, each step raising a faint cloud of dust from the stone floor. He drew back the covering himself, unwilling to let her hands touch it before his own, and found the parlor piano exactly as she had described it, its casing split along one side, its keys yellowed and several missing entirely, its strings hanging loose and rusted where the frame had warped with damp. He remembered this instrument. He had learned his earliest scales upon it, before his father had purchased the grand pianoforte that now sat neglected in the Manor's music room above. Master Julian had favored this smaller piano for teaching, claiming its imperfect tone forced a student to listen more carefully, to compensate with skill for what the instrument itself could not provide. "Show me," Marcus said, his voice rougher than he intended. Vivian knelt beside the piano and carefully drew open the lower panel, the one concealing the soundboard and its supporting frame. She had clearly done this before, her movements practiced rather than tentative, and within moments she had exposed the section of bracing she had described to him, a length of wood noticeably different in color and grain from the rest, fitted with a precision that no accidental repair would have required. "You see how it has been cut and refitted," she said, running her fingers lightly along the seam. Whoever did this understood carpentry well enough to make the alteration nearly invisible unless one knew to look for it. And here, along this edge, you can still see traces of the cloth strip I removed, glued down to seal the gap where the pages were folded and pressed inside. Marcus crouched beside her, his knees protesting the unfamiliar posture, and examined the frame with his own eyes. The workmanship was, as she said, careful, deliberate. Not the work of a man in a hurry to conceal something in panic, but the work of a man who had planned this hiding place in advance, who had perhaps spent weeks considering where his final composition might be safest. "He knew he was dying," Marcus said slowly, more to himself than to Vivienne. "He must have known, and chosen to hide the manuscript here rather than risk it falling into hands he did not trust. It would explain why nothing was ever found among his papers when his rooms were cleared," Vivienne offered. "If the pages were already here, hidden inside an instrument in a house belonging to his favorite pupil, there would have been nothing left in his own rooms to discover." Marcus said nothing for a long moment. He reached out and touched the split casing of the piano, feeling the old grief rise again, sharper now for being confirmed rather than merely suspected. His mentor had trusted him, had trusted this house, this room, enough to leave behind the one thing he had not finished, the one thing he had perhaps hoped his pupil might one day complete in his place. "Why here?" Marcus said finally, "and not simply given to me directly, if he trusted me so completely?" Vivian considered the question with the same careful attention she seemed to give everything. Perhaps he feared what might happen to it in the wrong hands before his death was even certain. A hidden manuscript cannot be seized, cannot be sold, cannot be claimed by a rival while its owner still draws breath to defend it. Perhaps he believed it safer here, waiting, than anywhere it might be found too soon. It was, Marcus thought, exactly the sort of caution his mentor would have exercised. Master Julian had never trusted easily, had always kept his most important work close and unspoken of until it was finished beyond dispute. That he had chosen to hide rather than announce his final composition did not surprise Marcus half so much as the fact that no one, in 9 years, had thought to look inside a broken piano bound for the woodpile. "You have done something remarkable, Miss Blythe," Marcus said, rising slowly to his feet and looking down at her still kneeling beside the ruined instrument. "Whatever suspicion I carried these past 2 days, I confess it has no place remaining in this room." Vivienne looked up at him, and for the first time since Christmas night, something like a genuine smile touched her expression. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, it is time you returned to your own piano upstairs. The manuscript will mean little if it is never played." Marcus did not answer at once. He glanced instead at the broken instrument before them, at the hollow space where his mentor's trust had waited undisturbed for nearly a decade, and felt the first cold thread of fear settle beneath his relief. Finding the manuscript had been Vivienne's doing. Playing it, he understood now, would be entirely his own burden to carry. The grand pianoforte had sat untouched in the Manor's music room for 6 years, its lid closed, a fine layer of dust settling over the polished wood, despite the housemaid's best efforts to keep the room presentable for guests who never came. Marcus stood before it now, The restored second movement spread across the music stand and found that his hands would not move. Vivian had not accompanied him this time. He had asked to attempt this alone, and she had agreed without argument, though he suspected she understood better than she let on how much courage the request had cost him to make. He lowered himself onto the bench and rested his fingers lightly upon the keys, feeling their familiar cool weight beneath his skin. It had been 6 years since he had played anything more complicated than the simplest of scales. 6 years since the accident that had left his left ear deaf to anything above the lower registers, turning every chord he attempted into a lopsided, unbalanced thing that sounded wrong in ways he could not always identify, only feel, like a wound reopening each time he tried. He began to play regardless. The first bars came stumbling and uncertain, his fingers remembering the shape of the notation faster than his ear could confirm it was correct. By the fourth measure, the melody began to twist away from what he knew it should be, the upper voice bleeding into a muddiness he could not untangle, his damaged hearing offering him only half the picture, as though someone had covered one eye and asked him to judge the whole of a painting. He struck the keys harder, trying to force clarity that would not come, until frustration overtook him entirely, and his hand came down flat and hard across the lower octaves, producing a discordant crash that echoed through the empty room. He sat there afterward with his head bowed, his shoulders rigid, the silence that followed somehow louder than anything he had just played. "Your Grace." He had not heard the door. Vivian stood just inside it, her expression carefully neutral, though he could see she had witnessed at least the end of his outburst. "I asked to be left alone," he said, not looking at her. "You did," she agreed, "and I very nearly obeyed you, until I heard that from the corridor and judged that perhaps you needed company more than solitude just now." Marcus laughed, a short and humorless sound. "There is nothing you can do about this, Miss Blythe. My ear does not improve with company. It has not improved in 6 years, and I do not expect it shall improve simply because someone stands beside me while I fail." "Perhaps not," she said, crossing the room and settling herself on the bench beside him without invitation, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of beeswax and ink that seemed to follow her everywhere from her work among the library shelves. "But you are trying to hear this piece the way you once did, and I do not think that is the way forward for you any longer. There is no other way to play music, Miss Blythe. One hears it or one does not." "That is not entirely true." She reached out and touched the manuscript on the stand before them, her finger tracing the notation rather than the keys. "You were trained for years to read this before you were ever trained to play it. You know the shape of a chord on the page long before your fingers ever find it on the keys. I have watched you these past days, Your Grace, and I think you have forgotten how much of music lives in the eye and the mind before it ever reaches the ear at all." Marcus stared at the page she indicated, at the careful architecture of notes climbing and descending across the staff, the intervals and harmonies laid bare in ink exactly as his mentor had intended them. He had spent his whole life reading music before playing it, correcting students' errors from across a room without ever needing to hear a note struck. It had simply never occurred to him, in the wreckage of the accident, that this same skill might serve him now that his ear had become an unreliable witness. "You are suggesting I play by sight alone," he said slowly, "trusting the notation rather than what I hear." "I am suggesting you trust what you know to be correct on the page and treat whatever your ear tells you afterward as something to be questioned rather than obeyed without argument. You have spent 6 years assuming your hearing must be the final judge of every note you play. Perhaps it is time your eye and your memory were permitted a vote as well." Marcus looked down at his hands resting on the keys, then back at the manuscript, reading the second phrase more carefully this time, tracing each interval with his eye before allowing his fingers to move. He played the passage again, slower now, deliberately watching the shape of the notation rather than listening for confirmation that never fully came. The result was imperfect still, uneven in places where his fingers had grown stiff with disuse, but it did not collapse into the muddy chaos of his first attempt. "It is not right," he said, though there was less despair in his voice now than there had been minutes before. No, Vivian agreed, but it is closer than it was a moment ago, and closer than it was 6 years ago when you last permitted yourself to try at all. Marcus said nothing further, but he did not close the lid of the pianoforte either. He played the passage a third time and a fourth, each attempt steadier than the last, while Vivian sat quietly beside him, offering no further instruction, simply present in the way that seemed, he was beginning to understand, entirely characteristic of her. It was not correction she offered him. It was patience, and perhaps that, more than any trick of sight reading, was what had been missing from this room for 6 long years. News, Marcus had learned long ago, travelled faster through servants' quarters than through any formal channel of correspondence, and so he was not entirely surprised when his valet informed him, some 3 weeks into January, that talk of a rediscovered manuscript by the late Master Julian had reached as far as the village coach house and the inns beyond it. What surprised him was how quickly that talk had found its way to Lord Gregory. The letter arrived on a bitter grey morning, delivered not by a servant of the manor, but by a boy from the village inn, who stood shivering at the door until he was given a coin for his trouble. Marcus broke the seal in his study, recognizing the hand before he had even reached the signature, that same cramped and hurried script he remembered from his student days, when Gregory had been merely another pupil of Master Julian's, jealous and quick to claim credit that was not entirely his own. The letter was not long, but its meaning was plain enough. Lord Gregory had heard of the discovery at Blackwood Manor and wished to inform His Grace that Master Julian had, before his death, verbally bequeathed all unfinished compositions to Gregory himself, as recognition of years of devoted study under the man's tutelage. Any manuscript recently uncovered therefore belonged rightfully to Gregory, and he expected it surrendered without delay, or he would be forced to pursue the matter through the musical guild in London, where his claim, he assured Marcus, would find sympathetic ears. Marcus read the letter twice before setting it down, his jaw tight with an old and familiar irritation. He had known Gregory for over a decade, had watched him circle Master Julian's favour like a hawk circling a wounded bird, always eager to claim proximity to genius without ever quite possessing any of his own. That he would surface now, the moment word of the manuscript reached him, struck Marcus as entirely in character. "He is at the coach house," Marcus said aloud, more to himself than to the empty study, "which means he has come to press this claim in person and did not trust a letter alone to secure it." He found Vivienne in the library within the hour and handed her the letter without preamble. She read it in silence, her expression darkening with each line, though she said nothing until she had finished. "He claims a verbal bequest," she said finally, "nothing written, nothing witnessed so far as this letter states." "Gregory was never a man for written proof when a bold assertion would serve him better," Marcus said. "He knows well enough that no document exists proving any such bequest, because none was ever made. Master Julian thought little of him as a composer, and less still of his character. I do not believe for a moment that he would have left his final work to a man he trusted so little." "And yet," Vivian said carefully, "if the claim is entirely without foundation, why trouble himself to travel here at all? A false claim pursued too boldly risks exposing itself as false the moment it is examined." Marcus considered this and found he did not have a satisfactory answer. Gregory had never been a fool, whatever else he was. If he had come this far, risking the journey and the expense of lodging at the village inn in the depths of winter, he must believe he held some advantage, however slight, that Marcus had not yet accounted for. "There is only one way to learn what he believes he holds," Marcus said. "I will go to him myself." Vivian's expression sharpened with concern. "Your Grace, forgive me, but is that wise? To meet him alone, with nothing yet secured in your own favour?" "I do not intend to meet him alone." Marcus met her gaze. "You found the manuscript, Miss Blythe. You understand its history better than any other soul living, myself included. If Gregory intends to contest its origins, I would have you beside me when he tries." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. They found Lord Gregory in the private parlour of the coach house that afternoon, seated near the fire, with the self-satisfied ease of a man who believed himself already victorious. He had grown heavier in the years since Marcus had last seen him, his once sharp features softened by comfortable living, though his eyes retained the same calculating brightness Marcus remembered from their shared years of study. "Marcus," Gregory said, rising with exaggerated warmth. "I confess I did not expect you to answer my letter so promptly, nor in person. And who is this?" His gaze moved to Vivian with open curiosity, lingering a moment too long for Marcus's liking. "Miss Blythe restores books and manuscripts for my estate," Marcus said flatly. "She discovered the pages you now claim as your own. I thought it fitting she hear directly how you intend to justify taking credit for her labor." Gregory's smile faltered only slightly. "I make no claim upon her labor, only upon the work itself, which our late master promised me before witnesses in the final weeks of his illness." "Witnesses," Marcus repeated. "Then you will have no difficulty naming them, and I will have no difficulty writing to each in turn to confirm your account." For the first time since they had entered the room, something uncertain flickered across Gregory's expression, quickly smoothed over with practiced composure. "The matter is more delicate than a simple exchange of letters can resolve, Marcus. I would advise you not to underestimate how seriously the Guild will treat a claim brought before them, regardless of how confident you feel standing here in your own drawing room." "Then let the Guild decide it," Marcus said, "when you bring your claim before them properly, with evidence rather than assertion. Until that day, Gregory, the manuscript remains at Blackwood Manor, and I would advise you not to underestimate how thoroughly I intend to prove its true history before you ever set foot in London." Gregory said nothing further as they took their leave, though the look he directed at Vivian as she passed him lingered uncomfortably in Marcus's memory long after they had left the coach house behind. A look that suggested Gregory's confidence rested on something other than empty bluster, something Marcus had not yet discovered and did not yet know how to counter. The music hall in the market town stood beside the old guild house, a modest brick building where the local conservatory kept its records of teaching agreements, patronage contracts, and the occasional dispute between musicians that had required formal arbitration over the years. Marcus had visited it perhaps twice in his life, and both times as a boy accompanying Master Julian on some errand he had been too young to fully understand. He and Vivian arrived 2 days after the confrontation at the coach house, having sent word ahead to the conservatory's keeper of records, an elderly man named Mr. Whitlock, who had served in that capacity for longer than Marcus had been alive. Whitlock met them at the door with the careful, unhurried manner of a man accustomed to handling papers far older and more fragile than himself. "His Grace's letter mentioned Master Julian's affairs," Whitlock said, leading them through narrow corridors lined with shelves of bound ledgers, each labelled by year in faded ink. "A remarkable man, your late tutor. Difficult, mind you, but remarkable. He kept meticulous records of his own when he troubled himself to keep records at all." "We are looking for anything from the year before his death," Marcus said. "Any agreement, any correspondence concerning the disposition of his unfinished works." Whitlock paused before a shelf near the back of the room, running a knotted finger along a row of ledgers until he found the one marked 1805. "This should hold what remains of his formal dealings with the conservatory that year, if anything survives at all. Master Julian was not a man who favoured excessive paperwork. He trusted his word above ink more often than not, which, I confess, made him rather difficult to do business with." He set the heavy ledger on the reading table and left them to their search, retreating to his own desk near the entrance. Marcus opened the volume carefully, the pages brittle and faintly musty, while Vivienne drew a second chair close beside him to read over his shoulder. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour, turning page after page of correspondence copied in Whitlock's own careful hand. Contracts for teaching engagements, receipts for sheet music purchased on the conservatory's behalf, notices of concerts long since forgotten. Nothing mentioned Gregory by name, nor any bequest, verbal or otherwise, concerning unfinished compositions. "Here," Vivienne said suddenly, her finger pressed against a page near the middle of the ledger. "This is dated some months before his death." Marcus leaned closer. The entry was brief, a note in Whitlock's hand recording a visit from Master Julian to discuss the terms of his teaching arrangement for the coming year. Near the bottom, almost as an afterthought, a single line had been added. Master J expressed intention that any unfinished compositions at time of death should pass to his most capable pupil, to be completed as that pupil saw fit. No formal document requested. No formal document requested, Marcus repeated slowly. He spoke the intention aloud, in this very room, and asked for nothing to be written beyond this brief notation. But it does not name you, Vivienne pointed out carefully. Nor does it name Gregory. It says only his most capable pupil. Marcus sat back, the weight of this realization settling over him uncomfortably. He had assumed, upon reading Gregory's letter, that the matter was simply a lie to be exposed, a bold assertion built on nothing at all. But here was proof that Master Julian had indeed expressed some intention regarding his unfinished works, an intention that predated his death by months, recorded by a witness with no reason to falsify it. The only question left unanswered was which pupil he had meant. We must ask Mr. Whitlock what he recalls of the conversation, Marcus said, whether Master Julian said more than what was written here. They found Whitlock at his desk and put the question to him directly. The old man removed his spectacles, cleaning them thoughtfully as he considered his answer. I remember the visit well enough, he said finally. Though it has been some years, and memory is not always the reliable witness we wish it to be. Master Julian came to discuss his teaching contract, as the entry states, and near the end of our business he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had been considering what should become of his unfinished symphony should anything happen to him. I recall asking whether he wished this recorded formally, and he waved the suggestion away, saying his intentions were plain enough to anyone who had watched him teach these past years and needed no document to confirm them. Did he say anything more specific? Marcus pressed. Any name, any description of the pupil he had in mind? Whitlock's expression grew distant with the effort of recollection. He said, if I recall correctly, that the piece belonged to whichever of his pupils had learned to hear music with more than his ears alone. I confess, the phrase struck me as curious at the time, and I wrote it down nowhere, thinking it merely one of his characteristic riddles rather than anything of legal weight. Marcus felt something shift in his chest at these words, a recognition he could not immediately voice aloud. More than his ears alone. He thought of the music room at the manor, of Vivienne's insistence that he trust the notation before his ear, of the 6 years he had spent believing his damaged hearing had ended his claim to music entirely, only to discover now that his mentor's own words, spoken before witnesses months before his death, might have anticipated exactly this failing and valued him regardless. Gregory could not have known of this conversation, Vivienne said quietly, watching the realization cross Marcus's face. He was not present. He has built his claim on nothing more than assumption and confidence. Then confidence is all he has ever truly possessed, Marcus said, though his voice carried less triumph than she perhaps expected, and more of something closer to grief renewed, the strange ache of discovering that his mentor had thought of him, specifically and deliberately, in the final months of his life, in words no one had thought important enough to record until now. The decision to travel to London was not one Marcus made lightly. Whitlock's testimony, however promising, remained only a recollection, a memory unwritten and therefore vulnerable to doubt should Gregory choose to dispute it before the musical guild. If the manuscript's authorship was to be secured beyond any further challenge, Marcus understood he would need to register the work formally with the guild itself, and defend his claim before men who owed him no particular loyalty. They departed Blackwood Manor on a morning threatening snow, the sky pressed low and grey over the frozen fields, the carriage loaded with the portfolio wrapped carefully in oilcloth against the damp. Marcus had insisted Vivienne accompany him, arguing that no one else living could speak so plainly to the manuscript's discovery and restoration, and after some hesitation, she had agreed to make the journey as his assistant in the matter, a position that satisfied propriety well enough for the road, whatever complications it might raise once they reached the city. The first hours passed in relative silence, the carriage rattling over rutted roads while Marcus stared out at the passing countryside without truly seeing it. It was Vivienne who finally broke the quiet, some time after they had stopped to change horses at a coaching inn and resumed their journey into the gathering dusk. "You have not spoken of the accident," she said carefully. "Not once in all the weeks I have known you, beyond the fact of its consequence. I do not ask out of idle curiosity, Your Grace, but because I think it weighs on you more than you permit yourself to show, and I would rather understand it than continue guessing at its shape." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the last grey light fade from the fields beyond the window. He had not spoken of that night to anyone, not truly, not even to the physicians who had treated him afterward, who had wanted only to know the nature of his symptoms and cared little for the circumstances that had produced them. "It was early spring," he said finally. 6 years passed. I was travelling home from a concert in the city, later than I ought to have been, the roads still icy in patches, though the worst of winter had passed. The coachman misjudged a turn near a river crossing, and the carriage overturned. He paused, and Vivienne said nothing, allowing the silence to hold until he was ready to continue. I struck my head against the frame as we went over. I do not remember a great deal of what followed, only fragments, the cold of the water, the coachman's voice calling for help that seemed to come from very far away. When I woke properly, some days later, the physicians told me I was fortunate to have survived at all, and that the deafness in my left ear was likely permanent, a consequence of the blow rather than anything they could hope to remedy. "And you never returned to your instrument?" Vivienne said quietly. "Not once, in all the years since." I told myself at first that I needed time to recover fully, that once my strength returned, so too would my ability to play as I once had. It took some months before I understood the deafness would not heal, and by then I had already convinced myself that a composer who could not trust his own ear had no business calling himself a composer at all. It was easier, I think, to abandon the pianoforte entirely than to sit before it each day and be reminded of everything the accident had taken from me. Vivienne was quiet for a moment, considering his words with the same careful attention she seemed to bring to everything. "I do not think Master Julian would have agreed with that reasoning," she said finally. "Not if Whitlock recalled his words correctly. A pupil who learns to hear music with more than his ears alone. I wonder now whether he foresaw something of this, even before the accident occurred, whether he had always sensed you possessed some deeper understanding of the work that did not depend on your ear alone to survive." Marcus turned to look at her properly for the first time since he had begun speaking, struck by the thought in a way he had not anticipated. "You believe he knew this might happen to me?" "I believe," Vivienne said carefully, "that a man who spent years training you to read music before ever permitting you to play it might have valued precisely the skill that has carried you through these past weeks, whether or not he foresaw the accident specifically. Perhaps his faith in you was never dependent on your hearing at all." The carriage rattled on through the deepening dark, and Marcus found himself reaching for the portfolio at his side, drawing out several blank sheets of manuscript paper he had brought for exactly this purpose, though he had not yet found the courage to use them. "The third movement remains unwritten entirely," he said, spreading the pages across his knee by the dim light of the carriage lamp. "My mentor left us only sketches, fragments of melody without full orchestration. If Gregory intends to challenge my authorship before the Guild, I cannot simply present what was found. I must complete what remains, and prove the completion is my own." "Then let us begin now," Vivienne said, "while the road is long and there is little else to occupy the hours." They worked through the remainder of the journey by lamplight, Marcus sketching the shape of the orchestral parts from memory and instinct, while Vivienne copied his notation into a cleaner hand, occasionally offering a quiet observation about balance or phrasing that made him pause and reconsider a passage he had been too certain of a moment before. It was slow work and imperfect, but by the time the carriage rolled at last into the outskirts of London, the third movement had begun to take shape upon the page, no longer merely a memory of what his mentor had intended, but something new, built jointly from grief and patience and the particular understanding that had grown quietly between them somewhere along the frozen road. The Musical Guild kept its offices in a tall stone building near Covent Garden, its entrance flanked by columns that had witnessed the arrival of composers far greater and far lesser than Marcus over the decades of its existence. He had visited the hall only twice before in his life, both times as a young man, accompanying Master Julian to hearings of far less consequence than the one he now anticipated. He and Vivian were shown into the outer chamber by a clerk who seemed unimpressed by either Marcus's title or the urgency of his request, informing them that the guild's registrar would see them presently, though presently proved to mean the better part of an hour spent waiting on a hard bench beneath portraits of composers long dead. Marcus used the time to review the completed manuscript once more, checking each page against the notes he and Vivian had refined during their final night at the townhouse he had taken for their stay in the city. When they were finally admitted, Marcus found Lord Gregory already present in the registrar's chamber, seated with the same self-satisfied ease he had displayed at the coach-house weeks before, though something tighter had crept into his expression, a wariness he could not quite conceal. "Marcus," Gregory said, rising with a shallow bow, "I confess I did not expect you to travel so quickly. It seems my letter achieved its purpose after all, if belatedly. I have come to register my claim to the manuscript formally, before the guild, as you yourself suggested I ought to do," Marcus said, setting the portfolio on the registrar's desk without further preamble. "I trust you have brought whatever evidence you intend to offer in support of your own claim." The registrar, a thin man named Mr. Ashworth, with the perpetually weary expression of someone who had adjudicated too many such disputes over too many years, gestured for both men to be seated. "Let us proceed properly. Lord Gregory has indeed lodged a formal claim, asserting that the manuscript in question was verbally bequeathed to him by the composer prior to his death. His Grace, I understand, disputes this account and offers a counter-history of the manuscript's discovery." "I do more than dispute it," Marcus said. "I can demonstrate it to be entirely without foundation. I have testimony from the conservatory's own keeper of records, recorded in the ledger of 1805, describing Master Julian's stated intention that his unfinished work should pass to whichever pupil had proven himself capable of understanding music beyond the limits of mere hearing. No name is given in the record, but the description, I submit, applies rather better to myself than to Lord Gregory, who has never, to my knowledge, suffered any impairment requiring such understanding at all." Gregory's composure slipped further at this, though he recovered quickly. "A vague phrase, recorded second-hand by an old man's memory, proves nothing definite. I do not deny Master Julian may have spoken generally of his hopes for his unfinished work. I maintain, however, that his final and specific wish, expressed to me directly in the last weeks of his illness, named me as his intended heir to the composition." "Then you will have witnesses to that specific conversation," Ashworth said, his tone suggesting he had heard such claims tested and found wanting many times before. "I have my own word," Gregory said, "and I would remind the guild that a man's word has historically carried weight enough in matters of this kind, particularly when the alternative claim rests upon manuscript pages of suspiciously convenient discovery, unearthed by a servant in a household with every motive to benefit from their sudden appearance." Marcus felt his temper flare at the implication directed at Vivian, who sat quietly beside him, her expression carefully controlled, though he could see the tightness in her jaw. "Choose your next words carefully, Gregory. Miss Blythe's discovery of the manuscript and the months of careful restoration that followed are matters I can substantiate in detail, should the guild require it." "Can you?" Gregory said, and here his confidence returned in full, something almost triumphant entering his voice. "Then perhaps you can also explain, Marcus, why the handwriting on these newly completed pages," and here he produced from his own case a sheaf of papers Marcus recognized with a start as the freshly copied third movement, somehow already obtained, "bears remarkably little resemblance to Master Julian's established hand, despite being presented as an authentic continuation of his final work." The chamber fell silent. Marcus stared at the pages Gregory held, understanding at once what accusation was being leveled against him. The original second movement bore Master Julian's own hand, indisputable to anyone familiar with it. But the third movement, the portion Marcus had composed himself during the carriage journey and the sleepless nights that followed, was necessarily written in his own hand, not his mentor's, a fact Gregory now intended to twist into evidence of forgery rather than honest completion. "I have never claimed the third movement to be Master Julian's own composition," Marcus said carefully, forcing his voice to remain level. It was left unwritten at the time of his death, sketched only in fragments. I have completed it myself, using his notes and my own understanding of his intentions, exactly as the conservatory's record suggests he wished his most capable pupil to do. A convenient distinction, Gregory said, made only now that I have raised the question. How is the guild to know these fragments you claim to have inherited were not entirely your own invention from the start, with no true foundation in Master Julian's hand at all? Ashworth raised a hand before Marcus could respond further, his weary expression sharpening into something more attentive. This is precisely the sort of dispute the guild exists to resolve properly, and not through accusation exchanged across my desk. His Grace claims authorship of a completed work built upon an authenticated fragment. Lord Gregory disputes both the authenticity of that completion and the legitimacy of His Grace's claim to inherit the original at all. I will convene a formal hearing before the Guild's trustees 1 week from today. Both parties will be expected to present whatever proof they possess, and the trustees will render judgment based on the evidence submitted, not on the confidence with which either of you states his case. Gregory rose, gathering his papers with something almost like satisfaction, as though the mere scheduling of a hearing constituted victory enough for the day. 1 week then, Marcus. I trust you will use the time wisely, though I confess I do not envy the task of proving what cannot easily be proven. He departed without further ceremony, leaving Marcus and Vivian alone in the chamber with Ashworth's parting instructions ringing uncomfortably in the silence he left behind. Marcus looked down at the manuscript still spread across the registrar's desk, understanding now the full weight of what the coming week would require of him, not merely to defend a discovery, but to prove beyond doubt that the hand which had completed his mentor's final work was worthy of the trust that hand had been given. The townhouse Marcus had taken for their stay in London was modest by his usual standards, 3 narrow floors on a quiet street near Bloomsbury, chosen more for its distance from prying society eyes than for any particular comfort. It was here, in a study lit by candles that burned lower each night than the last, that the true labour of the coming week began. Ashworth's ruling had made plain what Gregory intended to argue before the trustees, that the third movement, being written in Marcus's own hand rather than Master Julian's, could not be trusted as a faithful continuation of the composer's true intentions. To answer this, Marcus understood he needed more than a finished score. He needed a completion so thoroughly grounded in his mentor's own musical language, so consistent with the harmonic choices and structural habits Master Julian had spent years drilling into him, that no reasonable listener could mistake it for invention rather than inheritance. It was slower work than he had anticipated. The sketches his mentor had left behind offered only fragments, a melodic line here, a chord progression there, sometimes no more than a single measure surrounded by blank staff paper where the rest of the thought had never been committed to ink. Marcus spent the first 2 nights simply arranging these fragments in what he believed to be their intended order, cross-referencing them against the completed second movement to identify recurring motifs, the small musical signatures his mentor wove through nearly everything he composed. By the 3rd night, exhaustion had begun to erode his confidence more thoroughly than any argument Gregory had raised in the registrar's chamber. He sat at the small writing desk in the study, staring at a passage he had rewritten 4 times already, unable to determine whether the harmony he had chosen served the movement's intended climax or merely satisfied his own damaged ear, which he still did not fully trust to judge such things correctly. "You have not eaten since this morning," Vivienne said from the doorway, setting down a tray she had clearly prepared herself, rather than summoning the household's single hired cook. "I cannot eat while this remains unresolved," Marcus said, not looking up from the page. "The orchestration for this passage refuses to settle into anything I trust. Every choice I make sounds correct to my eye and wrong to whatever remains of my ear, and I no longer know which judgment to believe." Vivienne set the tray aside and drew a chair close to the desk, studying the offending passage over his shoulder. "Play it for me, or rather, show me, and I will play what you have written, so that you might judge it as a listener rather than as the man holding the pen." "I have no violin in this house," Marcus said. "You have mine." She rose and returned moments later with a modest instrument he had not known she possessed, tucked away among her traveling things. I learned as a go. Before circumstance required, I earn my keep through more practical skills. I am no virtuoso, Your Grace, but I know enough to render a single line clearly. She positioned herself beside the desk and began to play the passage as he had written it, the melody rising thin and clear through the quiet study. Marcus closed his eyes, straining to follow the line with what remained of his hearing, but the upper register blurred as it always did, the notes bleeding together into something he could not confidently distinguish. I cannot judge it properly, he admitted, frustration rough in his voice. The very notes I need most to hear are the ones my ear fails me on entirely. Vivian paused, considering this, then set the violin's body against the surface of the desk itself, close to where his hand rested upon the wood. Then do not listen with your ear alone. Feel it instead. Wood carries vibration further than air does, and closer to true than you might expect. She played the passage again, and this time Marcus felt it before he properly heard it, a faint trembling traveling up through his fingertips where they rested against the desk, the pattern of the melody rendered not in sound, but in something closer to touch. Rhythm and pitch translated into sensation his damaged ear could not distort. He opened his eyes, startled by how much clearer the shape of the phrase became through this strange, unexpected channel. Again, he said. She played it a third time and a fourth, adjusting small details at his request, until between the trembling of the wood beneath his hand and the notation before his eyes, Marcus began to trust his own judgment of the passage in a way he had not managed in 6 long years. It was not a perfect substitute for hearing, as he once had heard, but it was something, a bridge he had not known existed until she had built it for him in the space of a single evening. They worked this way through the remaining nights before the hearing, Vivian playing each disputed passage on her violin, while Marcus rested his hand against the desk's surface, feeling for the truth of a phrase his ear could no longer confirm alone. It was slow and often frustrating, and more than once he grew short-tempered with himself when a passage refused to settle no matter how many times she played it. Vivian never once grew impatient in return, meeting each failed attempt with the same steady patience she had shown from the very first night in his study, as though she had always understood that this labor would require more than skill alone to complete. By the 6th night, the final movement stood finished, every measure checked against his mentor's established harmonic language, every passage tested by ear and by touch, until Marcus could say with genuine confidence that the completion was true to what Master Julian had begun, even where the notes themselves had never been his mentor's own. He sat back from the desk at last, the candle nearly spent, and looked at Vivian where she sat, still holding her violin across her lap, her own exhaustion plain in the shadows beneath her eyes. "I could not have finished this without you," he said quietly. "Not the manuscript, and not, I think, myself either." Vivian said nothing to that directly, only offered a tired smile and began carefully returning her violin to its case, though something in the silence between them afterward felt more significant than any words either of them might have chosen to fill it. The trial room at Guildhall was smaller than Marcus had expected, a plain chamber with a long table where 5 trustees sat in solemn arrangement, their expressions giving nothing away as Marcus and Vivian entered, with the completed manuscript carried between them. Gregory was already present, seated opposite with his own papers spread before him, and beside him sat a man Marcus did not recognize, introduced by Ashworth as an independent musical scholar engaged to offer expert opinion should the trustees require it. "We are gathered," Ashworth began, "to resolve a dispute of authorship concerning an unfinished symphony by the late composer known as Master Julian. His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, claims the manuscript's 2nd movement as authentic, discovered within his own estate, and asserts his own completion of the unfinished 3rd movement as a faithful continuation of the composer's established intentions. Lord Gregory disputes both claims. We will hear each account in turn." Marcus spoke first, laying out the discovery of the manuscript within the parlor piano, the conservatory's record of Master Julian's expressed intention regarding his most capable pupil, and finally, the careful process by which he and Vivian had reconstructed the missing 3rd movement from his mentor's fragmentary sketches. He kept his account measured, resisting the urge to look toward Gregory as he spoke, though he could feel the man's attention fixed upon him with barely concealed hostility. When Marcus finished, Gregory rose to offer his own account, repeating much of what he had claimed at the coach house and again in Ashworth's chamber, though he had clearly refined his argument in the days since, speaking now with greater confidence of a private conversation with Master Julian in his final illness. A bequest witnessed, he claimed, by a manservant since departed for the colonies, and therefore unavailable to confirm the account directly. Convenient, Marcus murmured, low enough that only Vivienne beside him heard it. I would draw the trustees' attention, Gregory continued, to the matter I raised previously regarding the third movement. His Grace admits freely that this portion was not written by Master Julian's own hand, but composed entirely by himself, based on fragments whose authenticity rests solely on his own testimony. I submit that a man capable of composing an entire movement in another's style is equally capable of fabricating the fragments he claims to have merely completed. One of the trustees, an older man with sharp, assessing eyes, leaned forward at this. A serious accusation, Lord Gregory. Have you evidence of fabrication, beyond mere suspicion of capability? I have my own draft, Gregory said, and here he produced from his case a bound set of pages. Composed independently, drawing upon my own years of study under our shared master, as a demonstration of how the movement might have been completed had it fallen to a pupil with legitimate claim to the work. I submit that any true continuation of Master Julian's final composition ought to bear closer resemblance to his established methods than his Grace's version does, and I ask the trustees to compare them directly. Marcus felt a cold unease settle over him as copies of Gregory's draft were distributed among the trustees. He had not anticipated this, a rival completion offered as a point of comparison, designed less to prove Gregory's own authorship than to sow doubt about Marcus's, to suggest that where two versions existed, neither could be trusted as authentic beyond dispute. The independent scholar was invited to examine both scores and spent several long minutes turning pages in careful silence while the room waited. Marcus watched Vivienne beside him, noting the tight set of her jaw, the same controlled tension he felt within himself as the silence stretched on. Both compositions demonstrate genuine skill, the scholar said finally, addressing the trustees rather than either claimant directly. I confess I cannot, from craftsmanship alone, declare one definitively more faithful to Master Julian's established voice than the other. Both men studied under him. Both have absorbed something of his method. Gregory's expression brightened visibly at this assessment, and Marcus felt the ground shifting dangerously beneath the confidence he had carried into the room. It was Vivienne who leaned close and murmured something that made him turn to look at her sharply. The counterpoint, she whispered. In the fourth measure of his second page, and again near the close of the movement, look closely. Marcus took the copy of Gregory's draft from the trustee nearest him and studied the passages she indicated. And there, buried within otherwise competent orchestration, he found what she had already noticed. A parallel fifth, precisely the sort of elementary voice-leading error Master Julian had spent years drilling out of his students, a mistake so fundamental that no pupil who had truly absorbed his teaching would commit it twice within a single movement, let alone leave it uncorrected in a score submitted as evidence. Might I address the trustees? Marcus said, rising. I would draw attention to two specific passages within Lord Gregory's submitted draft, here and here, where the voice leading contains parallel fifths between the outer parts. This is not a minor stylistic choice. It is precisely the error Master Julian corrected most severely in every pupil he ever taught, myself included, on more occasions than I care to recall. A man who studied under him closely enough to inherit his final work would not have committed this mistake even once, let alone twice within the same short passage. The scholar bent again over Gregory's draft, tracing the measures Marcus indicated, and his expression shifted into something more considering. His Grace is correct. These are indeed uncorrected parallel fifths, an error any thoroughly trained student of Master Julian's method would have been taught to avoid instinctively. Gregory's composure finally cracked. A minor oversight, hastily copied. It proves nothing beyond a moment's carelessness. Perhaps, the elder trustee said slowly, though I confess it proves rather more about the depth of your training than you might wish it to. His Grace's completion, by contrast, contains no such errors throughout its length, a consistency that speaks either to genuine absorption of the master's method or to remarkable coincidence. He looked to his fellow trustees, who exchanged brief, unspoken agreement among themselves. The Guild finds insufficient evidence to support Lord Gregory's claim of bequest, and finds His Grace's completion consistent with authentic training under the composer in question. The manuscript and its authorship remain with the Duke of Blackwood. Gregory gathered his papers without another word, his earlier confidence entirely extinguished, and departed the chamber without so much as a final glance in Marcus's direction. Marcus turned to Vivian, understanding fully now how narrowly the outcome had rested on her quiet observation, a detail he himself, in all his years of training, might never have thought to examine so closely. Spring came early to London that year, the frost retreating from the streets well before the concert season opened at the Royal Theatre, though Marcus felt little of the season's usual warmth as he stood in the wings on the evening of the performance, listening to the low murmur of an audience filling the hall beyond the curtain. 6 years had passed since he had last stood anywhere near a stage in any capacity beyond that of a reluctant spectator, and the old fear had not entirely left him, whatever confidence the Guild's ruling had restored. Vivian found him there, in the shadows behind the curtain, dressed for the evening in a gown of deep blue that suited her far better, Marcus thought, than the plain working dresses he had grown accustomed to seeing her in these past months. She had been invited to sit among the patrons in the gallery, a position of some honor arranged through Marcus's own insistence, though she had protested at first that such recognition belonged to him alone. "You look as though you mean to flee through the stage door," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "The thought has occurred to me more than once this past hour," Marcus admitted. "I have not conducted an orchestra since before the accident. I do not know that my hands remember how, whatever my eyes and my memory might insist." "Your hands remember a great deal more than you give them credit for," Vivian said. "I have watched you these past months, Your Grace, relearning what you believed entirely lost. I do not think tonight will prove any different, whatever fear tells you in this moment." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, aware suddenly of how much had shifted between them since that first Christmas night in his study, when she had placed a leather portfolio into his trembling hands and set in motion everything that had followed. She had never once treated him as broken, not in the cellar, not at the writing desk in London, not even now, standing in the wings with the weight of the evening pressing down upon them both. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "I would have you know that none of it would have been possible without you. Not the manuscript, not its defense before the Guild, not this movement I am about to conduct for the first time. You did not simply restore my mentor's work, Miss Blythe. You restored something in me I had long since given up for lost." Before Vivian could answer, the stage manager appeared to inform Marcus that the hall had settled and the orchestra awaited his entrance. He drew a breath, straightened his coat, and stepped through the curtain into the light. The applause that greeted him was polite rather than enthusiastic, the audience's curiosity plainly rooted more in the scandal of the recent Guild hearing than in any confidence that the reclusive Duke of Blackwood could still conduct a full orchestra after 6 years of silence. Marcus took his place before the musicians, raised his baton, and for one terrible moment felt the old fear rise entirely fresh within him. The certainty that his damaged ear would betray him the instant the first note sounded. Then he looked down at the score before him and found that he did not need to listen for confirmation the way he once had. He knew this music now in a way that went beyond hearing alone, knew the shape of every phrase from the countless nights spent reading it by candlelight, from the trembling of Vivienne's violin against the writing desk, from the visual architecture of notes he had learned to trust as fully as any sound. He brought the baton down, and the symphony began. The opening bars, drawn from Master Julian's own original first movement, unfolded with a confidence Marcus had not expected of himself, his gestures guided by memory and by the careful rehearsals of the preceding week, rather than by any sound his ear could fully confirm. When the second movement arrived, the one Vivian had discovered hidden within the broken piano, he felt something in his chest tighten, aware of every eye in the hall watching to see whether the rediscovered work would prove worthy of the reputation attached to its composer's name. It did. He could tell from the stillness of the audience, the particular quality of silence that meant attention rather than boredom, that the movement was received exactly as it deserved. And when the third movement began, the portion he had composed himself from his mentor's fragmentary sketches, guided always by the question of what Master Julian would have wanted, Marcus found himself conducting not merely a completion of another man's work, but something that had genuinely become, in some essential way, his own. The final measures rose and resolved, and for a moment, after the last note faded, the hall remained entirely silent. Long enough that Marcus wondered with a fresh stab of fear whether he had somehow misjudged the ending entirely. Then the applause broke, sudden and overwhelming, the audience rising as one, and Marcus stood at the podium with his baton lowered, understanding only slowly that the ovation was genuine, that whatever doubt had followed him into that hall had been thoroughly answered by the music itself. He turned toward the gallery before the applause had fully subsided, searching until he found Vivienne standing among the patrons, her hands pressed together, her expression carrying something far deeper than mere polite approval. Marcus extended his hand toward her, a gesture the audience could not fail to understand, and gestured for her to join him upon the stage. She hesitated only a moment before descending from the gallery, and when she reached his side before the assembled orchestra and the still applauding hall, Marcus spoke loudly enough for those nearest the stage to hear him clearly. "This symphony belongs as much to Miss Vivian Blythe as it does to my late mentor or to myself. Without her patience, her skill, and her refusal to let me abandon what I believed permanently lost, neither this movement nor its completion would exist tonight for any of you to hear." The applause swelled further at this, and Marcus, standing beside Vivian before a full and genuinely moved audience, felt for the first time in 6 long years that the silence which had followed him since the accident had finally, truly, been broken.